Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be covering Esper Flyers in Murder Co-op Manor, or whatever the little words in MKM are. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. This is another very non-stats-based archetype. This is an archetype that I've kind of stumbled into a couple of times, and it overperformed, and so I thought there was likely something there. So this is, like Esper, I looked at the stats out of curiosity of Esper as a 3-color combination on 17 lands. They were not good, like 50%. It's hard to know what that really means. It wasn't particularly good among 3-color pairs or anything, but I also don't think that says anything about the deck that I'm talking about drafting. So not really worrying too much about the stats here. Just kind of talking about the kind of game plan and synergies and structure of an archetype that I've found that I like. So the first thing about Esper Flyers as a structure in this format is that all three of the Esper pair disguise creatures are flying creatures that are pretty good and play pretty well together. So the white-black one is Sanguine Savior, the 2/1 flying lifelink that when you flip it over gives something else lifelink until end of turn. I've been really happy to just cast that card face up on turn 3. It's given me a really, really nice life cushion and lead in racing situations that come up pretty often in this format because a lot of people draft aggressive decks. There are also a decent amount of times if I'm far enough on the back foot where I just play it face up and block their creature and, trade cards but gain a little bit of life, and that life cushion can be pretty valuable even in that mode. And then the white-blue card, Granite Witness, is the 4-mana 3/2 flying vigilance that when you flip it over for 2 mana, taps or untaps something. Pretty strong tempo play. You can often tap out your opponent's only reach creature or flying blocker to get in a big swing. If your opponent's playing large creatures that your creatures don't block very well, stopping them from attacking for a turn is often a big swing. This deck often wants to play creatures that have 3 or 4 toughness, so a lot of the creatures in the format you can block and not really worry about, but then the big creatures that can get through that, you can just kind of buy a little time with Granite Witness to get set up, and that can be a pretty big deal. Also, the Vigilance is nice because you're largely trying to play defense with your creatures, and this lets you kind of establish a clock on your opponent where you're hitting them without needing to tap one of your potential blockers. So it can threaten a block or a double block while also getting some damage in. And then the last part of this group is Fairy Snoop, the blue-black 1/4 flyer for 3 that when you flip it over for 3 mana, looks at 2 cards, puts 1 in your hand and 1 in the graveyard. This card is pretty important. I think it does a lot to let this deck function as a control deck rather than a tempo deck. It blocks really well and digs for your bombs, puts you up on cards, and also, very notably, plays really well with combat tricks. Just having both the evasive keyword and having more toughness than power means that it's likely to be around, so then if you cast On the Job, the 4-mana trick that gives all of your creatures +2/+1 and investigates, it's really easy for Fairy Snoop to just be an extra body that's been hanging around, not doing a lot, and then it's 3 extra damage on a turn where you're trying to finish them off with On the Job. Or, it's a creature that your opponent is pretty likely to attack into. If they have 2 or 3 2/2s or 3 3s, and you have this, they're going to attack, expect that you block one of their creatures and they push some damage, and then if you have something like +2/+2 investigate or lifelink death touch investigate, you're going to get to block and use that combat trick to kill your opponent's creature and investigate, and then draw the card, so you're up a little bit of value there. These 3 creatures kind of form the backbone of this deck at common. Together they let you play this pretty good evasive but also controlling like tempo, but mostly just to stay alive kind of game plan where like when you have to, you can definitely turn the corner and get aggressive, but you're not obligated to. I've liked Blue's ability to control the pace of the game, but my really tempo-focused Blue games or Blue decks have had a lot of trouble ending the game. Blue just doesn't have a lot of like powerful attackers, and so like Blue as like a tempo, like get them dead before people get to cast their spells strategy has not played well for me. But Blue with some of the like buy time type abilities, but trying to play a late game has worked well for me. And I think these creatures give you a lot of flexibility and let you do that. Cold Case Cracker plays really well with all of these. That's the 4-mana 3/3 flyer that investigates when it dies. You have a bunch of 3-drops, and then, sometimes you play them face up, sometimes face down. That's going to just depend on the situation. And then you can play Cold Case Cracker, get like a relatively large body for that stage of the game down, and then the following turn you usually want to start double spelling or flipping your creatures over. But the deck likes having a 4-mana flyer, and Cold Case Cracker is a really good one. As with any deck, it's important to have 2-mana plays. In this case, I don't think it really matters what you have. Like, just kind of any 2-drop is fine. It's maybe a little bit better to have something like Gravestone Strider, the 1/3 artifact creature that filters your mana, because it blocks pretty well and often stays in play when it blocks. Which, again, for the same reason that Fairy Snoop plays well in this deck, you're kind of not looking to trade in general. You're looking to just have your creatures bounce, and I'm going to get into more detail about that, I suppose, now. So, structurally, I see this deck as a big game attrition deck, which is pretty unusual and a little hard to wrap your head around. So you do want to play removal and cards that trade 1-for-1, but you're not looking to trade off creatures that are in play. You're specifically trying to make the board as messy as possible. If you have a lot of creatures with low power and high toughness, it becomes really difficult for your opponent to attack because you can double or triple block and they won't be able to kill very many of your blockers and they'll lose attackers. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to play an attrition strategy that revolves around virtual card advantage. Virtual card advantage is a concept where you generate something that functions like card advantage, where your opponent kind of runs out of stuff to do, not by actually removing your opponent's cards, but by making them irrelevant. So if you have a bunch of 1/3 and 1/4 creatures, all of your opponent's 2/2s or maybe 3/3s or any other creatures they have that don't have profitable attacks and can't block your creatures might as well not be there. And so the more messy the board can be, the more likely it is that you're invalidating more of your opponent's cards. And so this large game actually functions as part of your attrition strategy to invalidate rather than destroy your opponent's cards. You still want some removal because you're playing a controlling strategy and you need to be able to answer your opponent's bombs, or there are things that are stopping you from clocking them when that's important, or they're creatures that are big enough to get through, or sometimes most importantly, to be able to kill their creature when they use a combat trick in a spot where you've set up a double block and they're trying to get past that. So you need a bit of interaction, but it plays differently than a lot of tempo strategies because you want creatures that are going to stay in play rather than creatures that are going to trade. Incidentally, this works super well with Wisp Drinker Vampire, the white-black uncommon 2/4 flyer that can give all of your creatures lifelink and death touch all of your small creatures lifelink and death touch for 7 mana. Of course, the more creatures you have in play, the more powerful that ability is. So if your deck is already designed to play a bunch of low power creatures that are just going to hang out and play, eventually you'll get to the point where Wisp-Drinker Vampire really invalidates all of your opponent's creatures. So I hope all of that makes sense. Because I think that understanding that that's what you're playing for in this archetype is really important. And I also think that this is a pretty unusual strategy. I can't think of the last deck that I've talked about that plays quite this way. So that's kind of my thinking on my creature selection. So I'm mostly even though I describe this as a Flyers deck, and there are definitely spots where you'll take an aggressive position, I'm more interested in Gravestone Strider or even the 1/3 Detective that gets +2 power when other detectives attack, over something like Market Watch Phantom, the 2-mana 2/2 that gets flying when you play a creature, which can lead to draws where you just kind of run your opponent over and it's a serviceable 2-drop, but I'm more interested in being able to play a more defensive game and killing my opponent as an afterthought as is maybe a little bit too much my nature. The other thing is I think the tricks and tempo plays in this color combination work super, super well, especially the Auspicious Arrival, the 2-mana +2/+2 Make a Clue, and Toxin Analysis, and On the Job. On the Job being the 4-mana +2/+1 all your creatures investigate, Toxin Analysis +1/+1, or not +1/+1, just Lifelink Death Touch investigate. All of those tricks are really good if you're playing a long enough game that you can afford to spend the mana to sacrifice the clue, and also really good if you are going to reliably have creatures in play and be able to generate creature combat kind of on command. The deck also uses other cards that investigate, like Deduce, the 1 and a blue draw card investigate, Novice Inspector, the white 1/2 investigate, Out Cold, the 4-mana tap 2 things, put stun counters on them, investigate. All of those cards play really well here because you're looking to play a long enough game that you can use those clues, and they all kind of buy you time, potentially push some damage, buy some life, give you material, get you further in your deck, do useful things. And the deck is really set up to just take advantage of all those clues, and happy to just hang out and generate a little bit of value on most of its plays. The reason that I frame this deck as Esper Flyers is both that I think that if you're trying to play this game that kind of gums up the battlefield, you don't want to not have flying and your opponent has flying and then your blockers don't work and they just kill you. But also kind of the way that this attrition strategy works is that your opponent's creatures don't do anything and yours still do because you have evasion, and so when the ground is stalled, some of your creatures are still going to have profitable attacks, which is why Granite Witness, for example, is so nice because of the vigilance, so it can, keep contributing to preventing their attacks while getting damage in, as I discussed earlier, in terms of establishing a clock. And then once you're ahead by enough, you can, start sending more of your creatures, and really trying to, close the door. As far as higher rarity cards, the cards you're looking for are basically just better versions of the commons, better flying creatures, better removal, normal control tools, any sort of bombs. A lot of the gold cards fit really well here. Wisp-Drinker Vampire, as I mentioned earlier, is perfect. I've really liked No More Lies, the white-blue mana leak that exiles the card that it counters. Coerce to Kill is fantastic. There are a lot of good options. There are also just some nice random rare flyers. Pretty much any of them will do. It was the rare 2/2 flying vigilance for 3 that draws 2 and then discards a creature with flying or instant that originally got me to explore this archetype. almost all of my instants or sorceries, rather. Almost all of my cards were either flyers or instants and sorceries, so it was just always draw 2, discard 1, which was very nice, and also encouraged me to draft a deck where that was true, and it was great. So, yeah, the cards you're looking for are the cards that Steam Core tells you to look for in a lot of cases. As with all controlling multicolor decks, further splashing is pretty easy. So I'm, not looking to pass a bomb just because it happens to require red or green mana. I'd rather take the bomb and try to find some way to modify my mana base to be able to cast it. Even more highly prioritize Gravestone Striders or some of the lands that fix. If it doesn't come together, sometimes you won't be able to put it in your deck, but it's better to give yourself the option to play an extra bomb than to let it go in favor of some kind of replaceable common. I think that the pool of commons that this deck is happy playing is pretty deep, and so you can definitely afford to let some of those commons, you don't need to take every Auspicious Arrival or every Sanguine Savior you see. You're happy to have a lot of those, but there are just so many cards that fit in each of those roles. It's not bad to take like a land or a rare or whatever over them. The fact there are a lot of commons that you like doesn't mean you should be drafting a lot of commons. It means that, you're going to be able to find a set of tools that work well together. So because you're really looking to trade off as little as possible and you're expecting your cards to hang out on the battlefield most of the time, you shouldn't expect to have cards in your graveyard, right? Like if your cards don't trade, they don't go to the graveyard. And so you shouldn't be expecting to have cards that utilize cards that are in the graveyard in your deck. So despite the fact that, compared to the Sultai Graveyard deck that I discussed last week, this deck is only one color different. And since both of them could splash, it's, one color that's maybe a little wobbly. So there's, you could find a lot of overlap, but structurally they want very different cards. And as far as splashing in this deck, you should not be looking to splash cards that use the graveyard. And notably, Curious Cadaver, the blue-black 3/1 flyer that returns from your graveyard to your hand when you sacrifice a clue. I could see that having overlap in both these decks, right? I talked about how this deck wants a lot of cards that investigate. You're looking for flyers. Curious Cadaver plays pretty well here because it works with all of that. And I would not mind playing a Curious Cadaver in this deck. Similarly, Curious Cadaver works really well with a lot of the graveyard engines. You sometimes get it for free. It plays extremely well with Shock Outline. It is possible to be motivated by Curious Cadaver to try to bridge these strategies in some way. Notably, Fairy Snoop also plays well in both of them. I wouldn't discourage doing that. That sounds like the kind of thing that I would do, but you need to be extremely careful about it and understand the tension that exists between the two strategies in their natural structure, where you're going to have to modify each plan somewhat and figure out how you want the game to play out, how much you're looking to trade, whether you should prioritize things differently based on that new set of goals. There's room for a lot of hybridization of strategies in this format, but it's important to do it very consciously and to understand what risk factors and tensions you're introducing to figure out on the fly while drafting how to prepare for those. So when trying to bridge these decks, be aware that their incentives point in different directions and account for that in some way. Alternatively, just remember that if you're fully on board with the philosophy of Esper Flyers, that you might not want to prioritize collect evidence stuff. Certainly, Bombs like Azoni would still be good to splash, especially since they're only looking for evidence very late. But something like Evidence Examiner might be a worse splash than it would normally be. That being the blue-green 2/2 that lets you collect evidence 4 to investigate. You'll have other ways to get clues in this deck. And, since it's in the structure going to be a splash, it's like not, 2-drops aren't the best splashes anyway. It's not going to add a lot to your game plan most of the time, and you won't necessarily have things in your graveyard to exile for it anyway, so it wouldn't be a high priority splash, even though it's a pretty good card in a lot of other contexts. So, in some ways, that's more to speak to how I think that, this format is pretty interesting, where even though the mana is such that there's a lot of ability for decks to kind of blend together and bleed into each other, the strategic incentives kind of do more than the actual color requirements to differentiate decks and lead people to draft kind of decks that exist in and take advantage of certain synergies in a way that focuses them on prioritizing certain clusters of cards and avoiding cards from other clusters or cards that don't work with the plan they have in mind. And of course, this fact is why I have mostly been ignoring 17 lands data, is that while there are ways to use 17 lands data to look deep at clusters that play well together, it's difficult and messy and not really pointed to in the normal game in hand win rate type stats that I usually refer to for ease of use, which I suppose ties into just what I like about this format. I think it's pretty interesting to, unpack all of the strategic pressures and clusters of cards that play well together rather than just yep, I'm a red-white deck, I want red and white cards. So anyway, that's what I see as going on with this, mostly controlling Esper Flyers deck. So, going to turn that over to Twitch chat for questions. So, anything that you've asked, regardless of anything I've asked that you haven't addressed it, or anything you've thought of that you haven't already asked, please ask again now. And while I'm letting people get some questions in, I want to, of course, thank the newest patron this week. So, Dolph, thank you very much for the support. If anyone else is interested in supporting the podcast and looking at what kind of perks we offer, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. All right. Questions. Does a card like Case File Auditor do enough as a bottom-heavy body to be useful in this deck, even if one doesn't do much, doesn't have a lot of cases or enchantments? So the question is, is a 3-mana 1/4 good enough? And the answer is no. You already have access to Fairy Snoop, which is, a lot better than a 1/4 that doesn't have flying and can't draw you cards and stuff. As far as, should you play Case File Auditor? Case File Auditor is not River Cajun. It's not a vanilla 1/4 for 3. If you're thinking about it or you've drafted it, you're probably going to be able to have at least one enchantment. I think that if you have 5 or more enchantments, regardless of whether any of them are cases, Case File Auditor is probably quite good, especially since the enchantments are often going to be fairly good cards like Makeshift Binding and Coerce to Kill. I think it's reasonable to take Case File Auditor early and try to find some of those enchantments, or to, take it kind of in the middle if you already have some. But, I would not really be looking to play Case File Auditor with 2 or fewer. In the 3 to 4 range, it's going to depend on whether any of them are cases that I expect to be able to solve, or whether they are, all very, very good hits, as well as just, what am I comparing it to? What's my next best other card? I do think that, Case File Auditor's body isn't irrelevant, but I don't want to invest a full card in it if I'm not expecting other returns. In which situation would I go for this strategy mid-draft? when I was already in this strategy early draft, like if, there are a lot of like good cards in these colors that are cards that you want to take early. And so if I find myself with, just some like good controlling cards and flyers, then I'll continue down this path. I don't know that it's something that I want to like pivot into. Like if I started 5-color green and I noticed that I have like a few flyers, am I supposed to like abandon the green stuff that I have to like only play the Esper stuff? I don't know, not necessarily. But if I, find myself in a multicolor spot where all of my cards are Esper, it might be useful to think about like this structure rather than like expecting to expand into green unnecessarily, to like see yourself as like, if you think of the format as consisting of 2-color aggressive decks and 5-color green decks, then you might miss a spot where you could be a 3-color control deck as opposed to a 5-color green deck. I think anything like Esper or Grixis and probably some of the other non-green, like, maybe Mardu or whatever. Is that all of them? Maybe. But I think it's reasonable to draft 3-color control decks that aren't green, where one might just be like, oh, I'm playing a bunch of colors. I guess I should be prioritizing Nervous Gardeners to make this mana work, and then I guess I'm 5-color green. So I think as far as like going into this strategy mid-draft, I think it's more about knowing to identify when this is where you're supposed to be as the draft is happening, and having it in mind as something where you could end up in that might lead to you not pivoting out of it and instead solidifying into it, where like if you're not aware of it or don't know how to draft it, you might either try to expand into more colors or try to cut one of the 3 colors to become a 2-color deck. Neither of those are necessary. Let's say you have a handful of each of the disguise hybrid commons, but the rest of your deck works as a purely white-black deck. How would you decide on running islands or not? I would usually just not run the islands. Like Sanguine Savior is the most important of these to cast face up, and you can already do that in white-black. And so like using a card to be a like black-white dual land, but only for the purpose of flipping over a couple of your face-down creatures doesn't make a lot of sense. I might, be in a similar spot to that, but where I play like a couple of blue cards and an island and some escape tunnels or something. But like, if you're just like a white-black deck that has some Fairy Snoops and Granite Witnesses, you certainly shouldn't throw islands in your deck. Does this archetype prefer Sanctuary Wall to Jaded Analyst? And if not, is the creature still having power being important? The reason. So I don't have enough experience to be sure, but my expectation is that Sanctuary Wall is better than Jaded Analyst for the obvious reasons that, like, I'm not really looking to trade off. Jaded Analyst is really bad at pushing damage here because I'm not, really looking to, like, sacrifice clues on my first main phase, and I'm not very highly prioritizing like Projector Inspector or other things that would naturally trigger the Jaded Analyst's ability to attack. And also, like a 3-2 without flying is very unlikely to have good attacks because I'm trying to strand my opponent's 2-2s. Where Sanctuary Wall can prevent the same damage early, but then later in the game can tap my opponent's larger flyers or reach creatures so that I can get in, or just kind of functionally trade up in terms of, my 2-drop can invalidate their 6-drop instead of my 2-drop trading with their 2 or 3-drop. So, I suspect that Sanctuary Wall is appreciably better for this archetype than Jaded Analyst. Given that I plan to get a messy board with this plan, how concerned would I be about the opponent playing overrun effects, and is there any way to mitigate this? Depends on the overrun effect. For the sorcery speed ones, you can use Out Cold and counter spells. In general, I think the natural way that this deck mitigates them is through Sanguine Savior and other life gain to just have enough damage that like you're not in range of dying to an overrun. And then, you can usually tell when your opponent is like making an attack based on the job and block such that the trades aren't too bad for you and you take an amount of damage that isn't lethal. So a lot of preparing for them is just seeing them, maintaining a healthy life total, establishing the clock that ends the game before your opponent can take advantage of them. Like, I would say in a lot of ways, the presence of those overrun effects and the pressure that they put on control decks in the format is why this deck has a place and is valuable. Like the fact that the life advantage from Sanguine Savior and the pressure from that and Granite Gargoyle matters so much and is like so good to have access to in your control decks is to end the game before your opponent can just kind of like play a bunch of creatures and find their overrun. Would I look at the blue-red disguise common as something on plan for this style of deck? Yeah, I mean, the gadget here gives you a 3/2 on the ground and a 1/1 flyer. It's 2 bodies. The 3/2 on the ground, as I talked about with Jaded Analyst, isn't a very valuable object for you. Like, it trades reasonably, can make your opponent, like, it's fine to trade it for your opponent's creature. Like, you're not expecting to have decent attacks with it, right? So you're just getting a 1/1 flyer, which can certainly help, but isn't transformative given that your deck has like a bunch of other flyers. Basically, I think it's fine, but worse than the like disguised creatures in your colors. And given that the disguised creatures in general aren't taken that early, I feel like you don't really want more than like 6 disguised creatures, and it's not that hard to have 6 total Sanguine Savior, Granite Gargoyle, Fairy Snoops. And so, like, the red-blue one would be about on par with, like, a Basilica Stalker, the 6-mana 3/4 flyer that gains life and surveils when it hits your opponent and flips over for 5. I think that both of these are, like, acceptable second-rate disguised creatures that you can play but hope to do better than. And of course, if you're going to play the blue-red disguised creature, you need to make sure that your deck has, probably like 8 blue sources or something so that you can get blue-blue to flip it over. Or that you're splashing red anyway. I suppose it and Dogwalker are both a bit better if you have Wisp Drinker vampires and stuff, because they can give you extra triggers. Also, the more on the jobs you have, the more that kind of thing you're looking for. All right. It looks like that covers it. I think this is like a pretty interesting archetype. I think that the ideas here in terms of like validating combat tricks in controlling decks by establishing board stalls is kind of like a pretty interesting tool to have in your repertoire of strategies that can exist, something to like keep in mind and look forward or consider in other formats. So I've found this to be a pretty interesting space to explore and consider, and that's going to cover it for this week. So have a good week, and I will be back next week with another archetype. Bye for now, everyone.
Prepare for light speed.